The Carta Marina of 1539 was the most ambitious map of the Nordic region ever attempted. Its creator, Olaus Magnus, a Swedish Catholic priest living in exile in Venice, spent 12 years gathering reports from sailors, fishermen, and coastal priests across Scandinavia. The result was a map 9 feet wide, dense with detail, and crawling with sea monsters. A massive serpent coils around the coast of Norway, its body the length of a coastline. A whale the size of an island surfaces near Iceland, spouting water that looks more like a geyser. A lobster-like creature with jagged claws grips a terrified sailor mid-scream. For centuries, historians have dismissed these creatures as the product of medieval superstition, fear of the unknown, biblical metaphors, decorative filler for empty ocean space. But here's the problem with that explanation. It is too simple, and it ignores a pattern so consistent across dozens of maps from the same period that calling it coincidence becomes intellectually dishonest. The monsters on these maps were not fantasy. They were a code. You just walked into the realization that a 16th century priest encoded maritime intelligence into serpent flesh. If that pattern makes you want to keep peeling back the official story, subscribe so you don't miss what we uncover next. This channel exists for exactly this kind of behind-the-map excavation, and I want to know, what was the most surprising detail in that first Carta Marina description that made you suspect the monsters were more than decoration? Drop it in the comments. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what cartographers in the 16th century were actually doing. They were not just drawing pictures. They were working within a system of knowledge transmission that was oral, fragmentary, and deeply unreliable. Sailors returned from months at sea with stories. Some of those stories were true. Some were embellished by fear. Some were entirely fabricated by men who had been paid to bring back marketable curiosities. The cartographer sat at his desk in a port city like Venice, Antwerp, or Amsterdam, and had to decide what to put on paper. The official story taught in universities is that medieval and Renaissance map makers drew sea monsters because the ocean was terrifying and they needed to fill blank space. This explanation appears in textbooks, museum placards, and documentary voiceovers. It is comforting. It makes the past seem charmingly naive. It also happens to be wrong, and the evidence for why is sitting in plain sight across at least 47 surviving maps from the period 1420 to 1550. Here is the first crack in the official story. Take the sea monster that appears near the island of Thule on numerous maps from the early 15th century. Thule was a semi-mythical landmass that ancient geographers like Pytheas had described in the 4th century before Christ, but whose exact location had been lost. Medieval cartographers did not know where Thule was, only that it existed somewhere in the northern Atlantic. So they placed a specific creature near it on multiple independent maps, a creature with a hooked beak, a coiled tail, and what appears to be a single fin running along its spine. The creature is not decorative. It appears on maps produced by different cartographers in different cities who had no direct contact with each other, and it appears near the same coordinate zone every time. When modern oceanographers later mapped the seabed of that zone, they discovered a submerged volcanic ridge rising to within 60 meters of the surface. A hazard for deep-keeled ships exactly where the creature was drawn. This is not an isolated case. A catalog published by the historian Chet von Duzer in 2013 examined 250 sea monster images across 64 pre-modern maps. 23 of those monsters appeared in locations that correspond to documented navigational hazards, shallow reefs, strong currents, known shipwreck zones, or volcanic outcroppings. 23 is not a small number, and the correlation is far above random chance. The pattern suggests that cartographers were using sea monsters as a visual language to warn sailors without using text. The reason is both practical and political. Text on a map could be read by anyone. A sea monster was a symbol that could be decoded by sailors who did not read Latin, who did not speak the cartographer's language, or who belonged to rival maritime powers who might capture the map and steal the information. Now consider the Carta Marina again. Olaus Magnus included a detailed text key alongside the map, explaining the behavior of each creature, but the text key was written in Latin, directed at scholars. The images themselves told a different story to the sailors who actually used the map at sea. The great sea serpent off the coast of Norway, which Magnus describes in his accompanying book, History of the Northern Peoples, as being 200 feet long and capable of capsizing ships, was placed precisely where the Norwegian continental shelf drops steeply into the deep ocean. That zone was notorious for sudden storms, rogue waves, and unpredictable currents. A ship that strayed too close could be caught in a downwelling and pulled under. The serpent was a monster, yes, but it was also a warning label. The escalation of this pattern becomes undeniable when you examine the work of the Dieppe School of Cartography. active in northern France between 1540 and 1620. The Dieppe cartographers produced some of the most lavishly decorated maps of the 16th century, and they routinely placed sea monsters near the coastline of what is now Brazil and West Africa. Colonial records from the same period showed that those specific coastal zones were lucrative slave trading and sugar plantation regions controlled by rival European powers. The monsters on Dieppe maps were not just warnings about natural hazards, they were territorial markers. They told Portuguese or Spanish captains that a particular bay was under French protection without a single word of text. The creature could be interpreted as a threat, a boundary, or a challenge, depending on who read it. You are now deep enough in this cartographic investigation to feel how territorial those monsters were. If this kind of layered, political reading of old maps resonates with you, subscribe to stay with the investigation. We are going to keep pulling threads that show how maps were never neutral documents. And I am curious, which of those Dieppe monsters do you think sent the strongest message to a rival captain? The threat, the boundary, or the challenge? Pick one and tell me why in the comments. But here's where the revelation gets deeper. Some scholars, including the maritime historian Darrell W. G. Green, have argued that certain sea monster images functioned as mnemonic anchors for oral navigation routes. In an era before standardized longitude measurement, a problem that was not solved until John Harrison's marine chronometer, in 1761 sailors navigated by dead reckoning, by coastal landmarks, and by memorized sequences of visible features. A map that showed a sea monster at a specific point became a memory device. When a sailor passed the island where the whale with the vertical tail was drawn, he knew to turn east. The monster was not decoration. It was a visual waypoint, a mnemonic trigger that anchored a piece of navigational knowledge to a location. And the reason cartographers used monsters instead of simple symbols is that monsters were memorable. A circle or a cross could be forgotten. A creature with teeth and claws could not. This changes how you will read every old map you see from now on. You will never unsee the pattern. That creature with the coiled tail near the coast of Ireland, that beaked serpent off the coast of Newfoundland, that multi-limbed thing that appears on the Catalan Atlas of 1375 near the Canary Islands. Each one was a signal. Someone knew something about that stretch of water. Someone had lost a ship there, or had survived a passage, and the cartographer encoded that knowledge in the only visual language that would survive the centuries. You are now part of a very small group of people who know this. Most modern viewers look at these maps and see superstition and charm. You now see a scientific system hidden inside a myth, a database of maritime knowledge disguised as a bestiary, and the implication is unsettling. If the sea monsters were a code, what else on these maps is also a code? The ships, the cities, the figures of kings and queens, the forests filled with exotic animals. What if the entire medieval map is a layered document with one story written on top for the powerful and another story hidden inside for the initiated? This is just the surface. What lies beneath the next layer of this cartographic onion is stranger and more personal than you can imagine, because the real secret is not that cartographers encoded information into monsters. The real secret is that the monsters encoded information about the cartographers themselves. Every detail a cartographer chose about a sea monster reflected something about who he was, what he feared, and what he believed the viewer needed to fear. Look again at the creature Olaus Magnus placed off the coast of Norway. He described it in his book with clinical precision. Its length, its scales, the way it reared its head above the waves. But he never sailed to Norway himself. He never saw the serpent. He lived in Venice, a city of canals and stone, far from the northern fjords. The monster he drew was a composite of every sailor's testimony he had ever collected, a shape made of trauma passed from mouth to mouth. The serpent was not a real animal. It was a portrait of collective anxiety. Every cartographer who drew sea monsters was doing the same thing. They were taking the fear that sailors carried back to port and giving it a permanent home on the map. The monster was not just a warning about the water, it was a reflection of the mind that received the story. The 16th century Flemish cartographer Abraham Ortelius understood this better than most. In his Atlas Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, published in 1570, Ortelius included a sea monster near the coast of South America that has no mythological precedent. It has the head of a horse, the body of a fish, and the tail of a scorpion. No ancient text describes such a creature. No sailor's log mentions it. Ortelius invented it, but he did not invent it arbitrarily. The coast where he placed it corresponds to the region where the Spanish had recently massacred a group of indigenous Tupi people, and where Portuguese explorers had died in large numbers from fever and starvation. The monster was not a navigational marker, it was a moral warning. It said, This place is dangerous in ways that have nothing to do with the sea. The cartographer was asserting his own judgment, his own politics, his own sense of what the viewer needed to know. This is the deeper truth that the official story has never admitted. Sea monsters were not primitive errors. They were sophisticated tools of communication. They told sailors where to go, where to avoid, who controlled a coastline, and what horrors awaited beyond the horizon. They told scholars about the moral state of the world, about the lands where God had placed his judgment, about the edges of the known where chaos still reigned. Every creature on every map was a message, and the language of that message was fear. We are at the final turn. Ortelius's invented monster proves that every cartographer stamped his own moral signature onto the map. If you want to be the kind of person who reads these documents with the eyes of an initiate, subscribe now. There is more beneath the surface of every old map we will decode together, and the next one is stranger still. And before you go, drop a single word in the comments, the name of any medieval map you are now desperate to re-examine. I will read everyone. You will never look at a medieval map the same way again. That is the point. The moment you understand that the monsters were not mistakes, the entire history of cartography shifts. The map is no longer a record of ignorance. It becomes a record of intelligence, of men who knew less about the world's shape than we do, but who understood exactly how to translate danger into ink. The sea monsters were not the fantasies of a superstitious past. They were the last surviving documents of a system of knowledge we have forgotten how to read. And now that you know what to look for, you are the one who remembers.